The sky over the Yalu River was a deathly gray that morning in November 1952. The cold Manchurian wind howled through the cockpit vents of Captain James Robinson's F-86 Sabre as he climbed through 25,000 feet. Below him stretched the frozen landscape of North Korea, a patchwork of white fields and dark forests that seemed to go on forever. His breath formed small clouds of condensation inside his oxygen mask as he scanned the horizon, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. This was MiG Alley, the most dangerous airspace in the world, where American and Soviet pilots clashed daily in aerial combat that would never make it into official history books. Robinson had flown 37 combat missions over these hostile skies, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold in the next 40 minutes. If you're enjoying this story of courage and survival against impossible odds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories from history. Your support helps us bring these amazing tales to life. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. 4 F-86 Sabres from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing would conduct a sweep along the Yalu River, the boundary between North Korea and Manchuria. Their orders were clear: intercept any enemy aircraft attempting to cross into North Korean airspace and engage if necessary. Robinson's wingman was Lieutenant Parker, a 24-year-old from Texas with just 12 missions under his belt. Flying his element lead was Major Harrison, a seasoned veteran with 49 kills, and his wingman, Captain Torres. They had taken off from Kimpo Air Base just after dawn, the frozen runway crunching beneath their wheels as they lifted into the pale morning sky. Robinson's gloved hands gripped the control stick as he maintained formation with his flight. The Sabre responded beautifully to every input, a testament to North American aviation's engineering genius. With its swept wings and powerful General Electric J-47 engine, the F-86 was the only aircraft in the American inventory that could match the Soviet MiG-15 in performance. But matching performance and surviving combat were two very different things. Robinson knew that Soviet pilots flying out of bases in Manchuria had the advantage of numbers, proximity to their home fields, and strict orders to protect the supply lines feeding the Chinese and North Korean ground forces. The radio crackled to life. Major Harrison's voice cut through the static. "Dragon flight, this is Dragon lead. Enemy aircraft bearing 350 at Angels 30. Count 20 plus contacts, maintain formation, and prepare to engage on my mark." Robinson's heart rate increased as he strained to see the enemy fighters. At 30,000 feet, the MiG-15s appeared as tiny silver specks against the clouds, growing larger by the second. He could make out their distinctive profiles now: the high-mounted tailplane, the bubble canopy, the intake beneath the nose. These weren't North Korean pilots. The precise formation and aggressive tactics spoke of Soviet Air Force pilots, likely from the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, stationed at bases across the Yalu. The Soviets weren't supposed to be here, at least not officially, but everyone in MiG Alley knew the truth. Russian pilots flew Soviet-built aircraft wearing Chinese or North Korean markings, engaging American forces in what both sides pretended wasn't happening. "Dragon 2, stay tight on me," Robinson called to Parker. The young lieutenant's Sabre tucked in closer, the wingtip barely 6 feet away. Robinson could see Parker's helmeted head turning, scanning for threats. The kid was nervous, but holding his discipline. That was good. Panic killed more pilots than enemy fire in these engagements. Major Harrison's next transmission came rapid fire. "Dragon flight, tally visual on bandits, multiple groups, correction, count now 30 plus. They're setting up for a bounce. Break on my call. 30 aircraft." The number sent a chill down Robinson's spine that had nothing to do with the minus 40-degree temperature outside his cockpit. This wasn't a routine patrol intercept. The Soviets were throwing everything they had at Dragon flight, 4 against 30. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Then Robinson saw them. Not 30 aircraft, more. His experienced eye counted the formations as they maneuvered into attack position: 35, 38, Perhaps 40 MiG-15s spread across multiple altitudes and positions. Some were setting up high to dive through Dragonflight, while others positioned themselves low and behind, ready to cut off any escape route. It was a classic Soviet tactical formation designed to overwhelm and destroy. Dragon Lead, Dragon 3. I count over 40 bandits. Recommend we egress and call for support. Harrison's voice was tight but controlled. The veteran knew what they were facing. Negative, Dragon 3. Our mission is to defend this airspace. All aircraft, arm weapons, and prepare for engagement. We'll do what we can, then get the hell out. Dragonflight, break left on 3. 1, 2, 3, break! The four Sabres snapped into a hard left turn, their wings vertical to the ground as G-forces pressed the pilots deep into their seats. Robinson's vision tunneled briefly as the blood drained from his head, but years of training kept him conscious and fighting. He rolled out of the turn just as the first group of MiGs flashed past, their cannons blazing. Tracer rounds lit up the sky like deadly fireworks. Passing so close to his canopy, he could see the individual projectiles. The distinct sound of 37mm cannon fire rattled through the airframe. "Dragon 2! Break right! Break right!" Robinson shouted as he saw 3 MiGs converging on Parker's position. The lieutenant responded instantly, throwing his Sabre into a diving spiral that threw off the enemy's aim. Robinson pulled his own aircraft around, trying to position himself to cover his wingman, but 2 more MiGs appeared from above, forcing him into defensive maneuvers. The sky had become a chaotic swirl of aircraft, contrails, and tracer fire. Robinson's training took over. Every instinct, every hour spent in simulators and practice engagements compressed into pure reaction time. He hauled the Sabre into a barrel roll, inverting at the top to check his 6 o'clock. 2 MiGs were there, closing fast. He pulled the nose through the horizon into a split S, diving vertically while rolling upright. The Sabre screamed through 8,000 feet of altitude in seconds, the airspeed indicator climbing past 600 knots. The MiGs followed, but couldn't match the Sabre's dive performance. Robinson pulled out hard at 15,000 feet, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Dragonflight, this is Dragon Lead. I'm hit. Engine fire losing hydraulics, braking for emergency egress. All aircraft, disengage and return to base. I repeat, disengage and return to base. Major Harrison's Sabre appeared in Robinson's peripheral vision, trailing smoke and losing altitude fast. 3 MiGs were pursuing him, firing in short bursts. Robinson wanted to help, but 4 more enemy fighters had positioned themselves between him and Harrison. The Major was on his own. Robinson saw Harrison's canopy jettison, then the tiny figure of the pilot ejecting from the doomed aircraft. The Sabre exploded seconds later, a ball of orange flame against the gray clouds. Harrison's parachute deployed, and he began drifting down toward enemy territory. There was nothing anyone could do for him now. Dragon 3 and 4 are engaging multiple bandits northwest, Captain Torres transmitted, his voice strained. We'll cover the egress route. Dragon 2, what's your status? Parker didn't respond. Robinson craned his neck, searching desperately for his wingman's aircraft. There, 2 miles east, low and trailing vapor. Parker's Sabre was intact, but surrounded by at least 6 MiGs. They were herding him north, toward Manchuria and the Soviet bases. Robinson made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He couldn't save Parker without getting himself killed in the process. The numbers were impossible. Dragon 2, if you can hear me, try to make it to the coast. Search and rescue will be standing by. Robinson's voice cracked as he said it. He was abandoning his wingman, but staying meant dying. And dying meant nobody would get home to report what happened here. All Dragon aircraft. This is Dragon 2, actual. Engine damage, controls sluggish. I'm going to try for the coast, but it doesn't look good. Tell my family I fought hard. Dragon 2 out. That was the last transmission Robinson heard from Lieutenant Parker. The young pilot from Texas would be listed as missing in action, his fate unknown. Decades later, Soviet records would reveal that Parker's aircraft had been forced down near Antung Airfield in Manchuria, where the pilot had died from injuries sustained during the emergency landing. He was 24 years old. Robinson found himself alone in a sky full of enemies. Torres and Captain Reed, Dragon 3 and 4, had broken contact and were racing south at maximum speed with multiple MiGs in pursuit. Robinson's fuel state was critical. He'd burned through thousands of pounds during the violent maneuvering, and his gauges showed less than 20 minutes of flying time remaining. The nearest friendly base was Kimpo, over 150 miles south. The mathematics were grim. Then the situation became impossible. Robinson's threat warning system, primitive by modern standards but effective enough, indicated multiple aircraft locking onto his position from multiple directions. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. The sky above him was filled with MiGs, not the 6 or 8 that had been chasing the other Dragon flight members, not a dozen. He counted aircraft in a rough mental tally that came to somewhere between 35 and 40 individual fighters. They had broken off their pursuit of the other Americans and were now concentrating on him alone. Every Soviet pilot in MiG Alley seemed determined to bring down Captain James Robinson. The first group of 6 MiGs came in high and fast, diving from 40,000 feet with the sun behind them. Robinson saw them just in time, throwing his Sabre into a defensive weave that spoiled their gun solution. 37mm shells traced past his canopy, close enough that he could see the shells themselves, not just the tracers. The MiGs overshot, their high-speed dive carrying them past him, but another group was already positioned below, climbing to intercept. Robinson pulled vertical, trading airspeed for altitude in a desperate gambit to gain energy advantage. The Sabre's engine roared as he climbed through 25,000 feet, 30,000, 35,000. The MiGs climbed with him, but the Sabre's superior engine performance gave him a slight edge. At 42,000 feet, Robinson rolled inverted and pulled through, diving back toward the earth with his throttle at maximum. This was the Sabre's element. In a dive, nothing could catch an F-86, but there were too many of them. As Robinson pulled out of his dive at 20,000 feet, he found himself in the middle of a massive aerial formation. MiGs surrounded him at every altitude, every direction. Some were firing, sending streams of cannon shells through the air. Others were maneuvering into position for shots. The sky had become a 3-dimensional maze of death, and Robinson was trapped in the center. His training said to keep moving, never give them a steady target. Robinson flew the Sabre like he'd never flown before. Hard turns that grayed out his vision, barrel rolls that reversed his direction in seconds, yo-yos that traded altitude for position, split-S maneuvers that dropped him thousands of feet in heartbeats. The G-forces were crushing, relentless. His anti-G suit inflated and deflated rhythmically, fighting to keep blood in his brain. Sweat poured down his face despite the freezing temperature. His breathing came in harsh gasps through the oxygen mask. Minutes felt like hours. Robinson lost track of time, lost track of his exact position, lost track of everything except the immediate threat in front of him. A MiG would appear in his gun sight, and he'd fire a burst from his 650 caliber machine guns, the tracers arcing out and sometimes finding their mark. He saw at least 2 MiGs break off trailing smoke, possibly damaged, but there was no time to confirm kills. Surviving the next 10 seconds took all his concentration. His fuel gauge showed 8 minutes remaining, then 6, then 4. Robinson knew he had to break contact immediately, or he'd be swimming in the Yellow Sea, assuming he survived the ejection. But every direction he turned, more MiGs appeared. They were coordinating now, working in teams to box him in. Soviet radio discipline was excellent. Robinson couldn't understand the Russian transmissions, but he could hear the tactical precision in their voices. A burst of cannon fire struck his left wing, punching 3 holes through the aluminum skin. The Sabre shuddered, but held together. Robinson jinked right, then pulled up into an Immelmann turn, rolling out, heading south. Two MiGs followed him through the maneuver. He pushed the throttle past the detent into full afterburner, feeling the extra thrust slam him back into his seat. The fuel gauge dropped faster, but speed was life right now. More MiGs appeared ahead, climbing to intercept. Robinson counted 8 aircraft in the formation. They were setting up a wall of fire, a killing zone he'd have to fly through. Behind him, the 2 MiGs on his tail were closing range, getting ready for shots. To his left and right, more Soviet fighters paced him, waiting for him to make a mistake. This was it. This was where Captain James Robinson was going to die, alone over North Korea, fighting 40 Soviet aircraft with an empty fuel tank and a damaged wing. But Robinson hadn't survived 37 combat missions by giving up. He remembered something an old instructor had told him during flight training back in Nevada. When you're out of options, make them think you've got one more card to play. The MiGs ahead were expecting him to turn, to dodge, to try to avoid them. Instead, Robinson pointed the Sabre's nose directly at the center of their formation and flew straight at them. He lit the afterburner again, accelerating to over 650 knots, faster than the MiGs could safely maneuver. The Soviet pilots broke formation. They scattered left and right, unwilling to risk a head-on collision with the American fighter that seemed determined to ram them. Robinson flashed through the gap they created, his Sabre buffeting in the turbulence from 8 MiG-15s. He was through. The sky ahead was clear for exactly 5 seconds before more enemy fighters appeared. These pilots were smarter. They didn't bunch up. They spread out, creating overlapping fields of fire that would catch Robinson no matter which way he turned. He counted 12 aircraft in this new formation, with more climbing from below to cut off a dive. His fuel gauge showed 2 minutes, maybe 90 seconds of flying time if he was lucky. The Sabre was going to flame out, and when it did, he'd be a glider surrounded by hostile fighters. Robinson's mind raced through options. He couldn't fight. He couldn't run. He couldn't climb or dive without running into more MiGs. The only option left was one that violated every rule of fighter combat he'd ever been taught. He chopped the throttle to idle and deployed his speed brakes, decelerating as rapidly as the Sabre's aerodynamics would allow. The sudden change in speed caused the MiGs behind him to overshoot, their pilots not expecting the American to slow down in the middle of a fight. The MiGs ahead were positioned for a high-speed intercept, their gun solutions calculated for a target doing 600 knots. Robinson was now doing 350, dropping through 300. The maneuver bought him 10 seconds. He used them to drop to low altitude, descending through 15,000 feet, then 10,000, then 5,000. The MiGs followed, but they were spread out now, their formation disrupted by Robinson's unconventional tactics. At 2,000 feet above the frozen North Korean landscape, Robinson leveled off and pushed the throttle forward again, accelerating south. The terrain below was a blur of white and brown, hills and valleys rushing past at 400 knots. Flying this low was suicidal. The MiGs could dive on him from above, and one mistake at this altitude meant plowing into a hillside at hundreds of miles per hour. But Robinson had noticed something about the Soviet pilots. They were cautious at low altitude. They'd been trained in high-altitude intercepts, not the kind of deck-level flying Robinson had practiced in the deserts of Nevada and California. He was betting his life that their training and discipline would make them hesitate. The bet paid off, but barely. The MiGs followed him down but maintained altitude above 3,000 feet, making gun passes from above rather than chasing him through the valleys. Their fire was less accurate from that range and angle. Robinson twisted and turned through the terrain, using every hill and ridgeline as cover, forcing the Soviet pilots to constantly adjust their aim. It was working, but his fuel gauge now showed 30 seconds, maybe less. Then the engine coughed. Robinson felt it through the whole airframe, a shudder and a hesitation that meant fuel starvation. He looked down at his gauges. The fuel indicator read 0. He was flying on vapor and whatever fuel remained in the lines. The engine could quit at any second. When it did, He'd have about 2 minutes of glide time before he had to eject or attempt a wheels-up landing in hostile territory. The engine coughed again, then caught, then coughed. Robinson's hand moved to the ejection handle, ready to pull. He scanned the ground below, looking for anything flat enough to crash land on. There, a frozen rice paddy, mostly level, about 2 miles ahead. If he could stretch the glide, if the engine held together for another 60 seconds, he might be able to put the Sabre down in one piece. Above him, the MiGs were still there, circling like vultures. They'd seen his engine problems. They knew he was finished. Some of them were already breaking off, heading back to base. Their mission was accomplished. The American was going down one way or another, but a few remained, determined to get confirmed kills. Robinson saw 3 MiGs line up for a final gun pass. His engine quit completely. The sudden silence was eerie after hours of constant engine roar. The Sabre became a glider, descending toward the frozen earth at 1,000 feet per minute. Robinson trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed and aimed for the rice paddy. He had one shot at this. The MiGs were diving now, tracers streaming past his canopy. They were trying to kill him before he could land. Robinson ignored them. All his focus was on the ground, rushing up to meet him. He was too low to eject now. The parachute wouldn't have time to deploy fully before he hit the ground. It was land or die. He lowered the landing gear, then immediately raised it again. The drag would kill his glide. He'd go in wheels up and hope the frozen ground didn't tear the Sabre apart. 500 feet, 400, 300. The rice paddy was bigger than it had looked from altitude, maybe 2,000 feet long. Plenty of room if he could keep the Sabre under control. The MiGs made a final pass, their cannons blazing. Robinson felt impacts along the fuselage. The instrument panel shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the inside of the canopy. But the Sabre held together, 100 feet, 50. Robinson pulled the nose up, bleeding off speed, trying to stall the aircraft just as the belly touched down. The Sabre hit hard, bounced, hit again. The windscreen crazed with cracks. The belly tank tore off with a screech of metal. The aircraft slid across the frozen ground, throwing up fountains of ice and dirt. Robinson was thrown against his harness so hard he felt ribs crack. The canopy shattered completely, letting in the freezing wind. The Sabre spun 90 degrees, still sliding. Then it stopped. Captain James Robinson sat in the wreckage of his F-86 Sabre, alive but barely conscious. Blood ran down his face from a gash on his forehead. His ribs screamed with every breath. His left arm hung at an odd angle, probably broken, but he was alive. He'd survived a fight against 40 Soviet MiGs and a crash landing in enemy territory. The odds had been impossible, but he'd made it. The MiGs circled overhead once more, then turned north and disappeared. They'd report him as killed in action, his aircraft destroyed. Robinson had other plans. He unbuckled his harness with his good hand and climbed out of the cockpit. His survival radio was smashed, but he still had his pistol and his emergency supplies. The coast was 30 miles south. If he could evade capture for 24 hours, there was a chance a rescue helicopter could get to him. He took one last look at his Sabre, the aircraft that had kept him alive through the impossible. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes. The left wing was barely attached. It was a miracle the aircraft had held together long enough to land. Robinson patted the crumpled metal affectionately, then turned south and started walking. Behind him, smoke rose from the crash site. Ahead lay 30 miles of enemy territory and the slim hope of rescue. The next 72 hours were a blur of cold, pain, and fear. Robinson walked by night and hid by day, moving south toward the coast through a landscape of frozen fields and hostile villages. His broken arm became infected. Fever set in. He ate snow and the few emergency rations from his survival kit. On the second night, a North Korean patrol passed within 50 feet of where he lay hidden beneath a fallen tree. He held his breath, his good hand gripping his pistol, ready to shoot his way out if discovered. The patrol moved on. On the third day, delirious with fever and exhaustion, Robinson reached a coastal village. He had no idea if it was friendly or hostile. He was beyond caring. He stumbled into the village center and collapsed. The last thing he remembered was voices speaking in a language he didn't understand and hands lifting him. He woke up in a field hospital behind UN lines. A U.S. Army doctor was checking his bandages. "Welcome back, Captain," the doctor said with a smile. "You gave us quite a scare. The Korean fisherman who found you said you kept mumbling about 40 MiGs. That must have been some fever dream." Robinson grabbed the doctor's arm with his good hand. "Not a dream. Report. Need to make a report. 40 MiGs, Dragon flight. They need to know." The doctor nodded. "Easy, Captain. Intelligence is on their way to debrief you. Rest now. You're safe." The debriefing took 3 days. Robinson told them everything. The ambush, the massive formation of Soviet aircraft, the loss of Major Harrison and Lieutenant Parker, his fight for survival, the crash landing. The intelligence officers listened with increasingly grim expressions. They took notes, asked questions, cross-referenced his story with radar tracks and radio intercepts. When he finished, they thanked him and left. Robinson never saw the report they filed. Years later, he'd learned that the encounter over MiG on November the 14th, 1952, had been classified at the highest levels. The U.S. government didn't want the American public to know how many Soviet pilots were actively fighting in Korea. The story of Dragon flight was buried in classified files that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Major Harrison's body was never recovered. Intelligence reports suggested he'd been captured after ejecting but died from injuries before he could be transported to a POW camp. Lieutenant Parker was officially listed as missing in action until 1993, when Russian archives revealed his fate. Captain Torres and Captain Reed both made it back to Kimpo Air Base that day, though Reed's aircraft was so badly damaged it was written off. Captain James Robinson spent 6 weeks recovering from his injuries. 3 broken ribs, a compound fracture of the left arm, severe frostbite on both feet, and a concussion. When he was cleared to fly again, he was reassigned to a training squadron in the United States. His combat days were over. He'd flown 38 missions over MiG Alley and survived encounters that had killed pilots with twice his experience. He stayed in the Air Force after the war ended, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1974. He never talked about the day he fought 40 MiGs, not even with his wife. The memories were too painful, the loss of his wingman and flight lead too heavy to discuss. But every November 14th, he'd raise a glass in private and whisper 2 names: Harrison, Parker, the men who hadn't made it home. The true story of that day remained classified until the 1990s, when the end of the Cold War led to the release of thousands of documents. Historians piecing together the air war over Korea discovered Robinson's after-action report and the intelligence assessment that followed. The report confirmed that on November 14, 1952, elements of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps had launched a massive strike against a flight of 4 American F-86 Sabres. The Soviet force consisted of 42 MiG-15 fighters from 3 different regiments, the largest concentration of fighters committed to a single engagement during the Korean War. The Soviets reported shooting down 3 American fighters that day with no losses of their own. American records showed 4 F-86 lost, with 1 pilot recovered. The discrepancy was due to Robinson's survival. The Soviets had reported him as killed when his aircraft crashed. They hadn't expected an American pilot to evade capture and make it to friendly lines. Soviet archives released in the 2000s provided even more detail. Multiple Soviet pilots had filed claims for shooting down Robinson's aircraft. The actual damage had come from at least 6 different MiGs firing at various points during the engagement. One Soviet pilot, a Captain Yevgeny Pepelyaev, had been credited with the kill. Pepelyaev was the top Soviet ace of the Korean War, with 19 confirmed victories. He would go on to have a distinguished career in the Soviet Air Force, never knowing that his supposed kill had survived. Robinson's story became a case study at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School. Instructors used it to teach tactics for surviving numerically superior forces. The maneuver he'd used, suddenly decelerating in the middle of combat to disrupt enemy gun solutions, became known as the Robinson reversal. His low-altitude escape through terrain was analyzed and incorporated into pilot training. His ability to fly a damaged aircraft with failing systems to a successful crash landing was held up as an example of superior airmanship. But for Robinson himself, the recognition came too late. He died in 1997 at the age of 74, never having received any medals for his actions that day. The mission had remained classified throughout his lifetime. His family found his personal papers after his death, including a handwritten account of the November 14th engagement. They donated the papers to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, where they remain today, a testament to one man's courage against impossible odds. The wreckage of Robinson's F-86 Sabre was recovered from North Korea in 2003 as part of a joint U.S.-North Korean effort to locate remains of American servicemen. The aircraft, serial number 51-13274, was found exactly where Robinson had left it, in a rice paddy 30 miles from the coast. The fuselage bore the scars of multiple cannon hits. Investigators counted 73 separate impacts from 37mm shells. Any one of them could have been fatal. That the aircraft had stayed airborne long enough for Robinson to crash land it was, in the words of one investigator, a miracle of engineering and an even greater miracle of piloting skill. Some of the wreckage is now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. A placard tells the story of Captain James Robinson and his impossible fight against 40 Soviet MiGs. Visitors to the museum often stop and stare at the twisted metal, trying to imagine what it must have been like to fly a damaged fighter through a sky full of enemies, knowing that every second could be your last, fighting not for glory or recognition, but simply for the chance to survive one more minute, one more mile, one more heartbeat. The sky over the Yalu River is quiet now. The Korean War ended 70 years ago, and MiG exists only in history books, and the memories of the few surviving pilots who flew there. But the lessons learned in that cold November sky remain relevant. Modern fighter pilots study Robinson's tactics, his decision-making under pressure, his refusal to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. They learn that sometimes survival isn't about superior technology or overwhelming firepower. Sometimes it's about pure determination, exceptional skill, and the will to keep fighting when every rational calculation says you should already be dead. Captain James Robinson fought 40 Soviet MiGs with a single F-86 Sabre and lived to tell the tale, though he rarely did. His story is a reminder that the greatest victories aren't always the ones recorded in official histories. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply making it home alive, even if nobody ever knows what you had to do to get there. The sky over MiG Alley claimed many brave pilots during those years. Robinson was one of the lucky few who defied the odds and returned. His legacy lives on in the pilots who followed, in the tactics that bear his name, and in the twisted metal of an F-86 Sabre that refused to quit, flown by a pilot who refused to die.